why, fair financing and tax justice is important, particularly at this time. So really the purpose of this, webinar, 2-hour webinar, is to, continue this conversation and build capacity of, child rights networks and CSOs within East Africa. We begin in Kenya today, and we'll have another convening for Uganda. So the idea is to, build our capacity on public investment for children and the role of Parliament in addressing the effects of COVID-19 on children. So, the research, as I said, the research that, was shared by the African Union on the impact of COVID-19 was quite illuminating. And I think that message should indeed reach the policymakers within the different contexts in Africa. So really today is just to continue this conversation, and hopefully, by the end of this, we'll be more renewed in our understanding of why this is important, and why fair financing, is something that we should take on a bit more robustly as civil society organizations who work on children's rights. So the expected outcomes for this convening is just, as I said, to increase our abilities in terms of understanding of the concept of fair financing and tax justice, and to increase our skills through, sharing our experiences in the current context, how we've been working, directly with children in the context of COVID-19, and perhaps, develop some sort of, come up with some plan on how we intend to engage with our own parliament here in Kenya in relation to this issue. So we are joined in our panel by the Sam Munyuwiny. Sam Munyuwiny is the Executive Director of Africa AICS, African Institute of Children Studies. He is also the lead of the Child Agenda Forum, which is one of the networks of children's organizations here in Kenya. And he'll be, sharing his experiences on this topical issue. And then, of course, we are joined by Natasha Ntini from the South African Parliamentary Support Trust, who will also be sharing her perspectives on this issue. So for me, on behalf of the Eastern Africa Child Rights Network, we highly welcome this convening, and we hope that the South African Parliamentary Support Trust would be able to hold this similar convening for other Eastern African networks, so that it's not only Uganda and Kenya, but that also, we involve Tanzania, we involve Rwanda, we involve Burundi, on this important subject. So I just want to perhaps, invite Natasha, if you have brief remarks, and then we can just delve straight into the discussion for the meat of this convening. Natasha?
Thank you very much, Anita, and good morning, everyone. Just like what Anita said, my name is Natasha Ntini, and I'm coming from the Southern African Parliamentary Support Trust. I think in my remarks, I would like to say thank you for joining us. Thank you for being part of this conversation. I will just give you a brief background of SAPS, to what we do and what this program is all about. So Southern African Parliamentary Support Trust is an organization that is parliamentary based. It's an organization that works with Parliament, we support Parliament, the works of Parliament, and we also work with CSOs to try and facilitate engagement with Parliament. How we work with CSOs is that we build their capacity around parliamentary procedures and processes so that they'll be able to engage effectively with Parliament. So this is part of this program. It's part of our capacity building initiatives with CSOs to build capacity around the mandate of Parliament. And as you know, one of the functions of Parliament is approving the budget, the national budget. So it is very important for CSOs to take part in the budget process. That's why we found it necessary for us to have a discussion around financing and the national budget so that our engagement with the Parliament will also be effective. So under this program, we want to try and increase funding for children. We want to advocate for increase of budget or investment in children. So it is very important that we all have a discussion as CSOs that focus on different matters around children. It's very important that we also put our heads together and have a discussion around how all our needs or the needs of the children can then be financed. And this can be done through understanding the procedures and processes of Parliament. So I think that's just it from me. From SAPS, we are also joined. I have my colleagues, Henry, he's also an expert around parliamentary procedures. I also have Kuzai Muwishi. I also have Vivian, who is also a legal person, and he understands a lot about legislation. I also have Tafatwa, who works around parliamentary processes as well. So this is it for me. Thank you very much for joining us. Over to you, Anita. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Natasha, for that. Perhaps when any of the panelists are speaking, maybe you could just put on your video so that people can relate with you as you make your presentation. But thank you very much, Natasha, and your team, and we appreciate this relationship. Yeah, so I think colleagues, if you allow me, I think we want to go straight into the meat of this discussion. And one of the things that we really want to understand is why fair financing and tax justice for children. Why should we think about this issue? What are some of the legal groundings, whether it's international or regional law or national law in relation to fair financing and tax justice for children? Are there regional, sub-regional, sub-regional conventions or declarations that talk about fair financing and tax justice in relation to specific thematic issues that affecting children, perhaps health, perhaps education, that we need to talk about? How are budgets dispersed for children in terms of expenditures? Are these things that we really do track as CSOs, in Africa? Particularly also in Kenya, is this something that we really take into consideration? How about resource mobilization for children? Is this something that we really look into keenly? Most of within this context, most of our budgets are read. I mean, our 1 year, the financial period when budgets are read, we don't really, look into the finer details of, how the specific taxation, either increase or decrease of specific, tax-related issues affect children. So we want to really look at this from, a regional perspective and perhaps bring it a bit more to the national Kenyan context. So we have two very able speakers to, share with us this information, and perhaps we can ask questions at the end of this convening. So colleagues, I just want to invite then Natasha, to take us through the next presentation. Natasha?
Oh, I was busy talking to myself. Good morning once again, and thank you, Anita. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we are.
Okay, that's fine. So today we're going to be talking about fair financing and tax justice for children. For us to have an understanding of what we're going to be talking about, I think it's very important for us to start by redefining the key terms that are appearing in our discussion. We've got fair financing. I know it sounds complicated, and tax justice. You know, when people hear the words finance and tax, they start thinking about all the complicated stuff that we used to run away from in school. So we're just going to redefine the key terms so that we can at least understand the basis of our conversation. So financing in general is an act of providing money or funds for certain projects. We are simply saying how much or do we have money for projects that we want to do. And fair financing now brings in the aspect of equity to say gender. Are we taking account of the gender issues around our financing? How much we are providing for our projects? Are we taking in account issues around disabilities and the status to say some people are poor and others are rich? Are we also taking in account issues of geography, where people are living, whether children are living in urban areas or rural areas? So fair financing is really about bringing in the aspect of equity in providing money or funds for projects. Now, when we look at fair financing in the aspect of children, when we're focusing on children, we're saying this is the allocation of resources towards child-focused sectors, keeping in mind the issues of equity, that is to say gender, where they are coming from, whether they are able or disabled. So it's really focusing on children and focusing on financing the key sectors that make sure that our children can survive, can develop, and can also learn. Then when we're talking about tax justice, we're saying these are tax systems that generate sufficient public revenue while ensuring that this revenue is fairly redistributed and focused on rebalancing inequalities. So for tax, tax is used to generate revenue, right? So we have to make sure that this revenue is enough for us to fairly redistribute it, and it also rebalances the inequalities.
Sorry, Natasha. Let me disrupt you a bit. I think there's somebody who's joining, but kindly just mute your microphone as you join the conversation. Kindly, if you're not speaking, kindly just mute your microphone, please. Thank you. Natasha?
Thank you. So these are the general definitions of fair financing and tax justice. And then when we look at fair financing, the aspect of financing and the aspect of tax, when you look at it from a budget, we are saying that fair financing is the spending side of the budget, the finance side of the budget, the financing side, where we are saying, how are we sharing the cake? How much are we putting towards social security? How much are we putting towards defense? And how much are we allocating towards health and even nutrition? And then when we are talking about tax justice, we are referring to the revenue side of our national budgets to say, how is our tax structured? How is the tax system structured? How much is expected from individual income taxes, the corporate taxes? How are we structuring these taxes? So really, fair financing and tax justice is looking at the budget, and it's looking at the expenditure side of the budget as well as the revenue side of the budget. Now, going on to the expenditure side of the budget, why is it that we want to talk about expenditure for children? Why is it so important that we then choose to say, let's think about spending around children or spending for children. So there are basically three arguments that have been used that we use around justifying expenditure for children. The first one is the rights-based argument, which is based on Article 4 of the UNCRC, which binds all signatory countries to act. We'll talk about this in more detail. So we had Anita talking about these instruments. We've got international instruments, the UNCRC, we also have the African instruments, the regional instruments, that is the African Charter on the Rights of the Children. And all these instruments are binding signatory countries to act, to actually allocate resources towards children. And then we have the economic argument, which relates to the need to invest in the country's human capital. We all know that for something to produce fruitful results later, we need to invest in it whilst it's still young. So the economic argument is just to make sure that we are investing in our capital for future use. And our capital, the human capital, we are investing it at a tender age, that is our children, for fruitful results when they grow older, for economic benefits. And then we move on to the political and social argument, which simply explains how inadequate social investment and high levels of inequality and severe poverty can undermine social cohesion. So we believe that when we invest in our children, we reduce levels of inequality, then it means that they have undermined the social cohesion in our societies. So that is the political and social argument. So the rights arguments that we're talking about is referring to the international, regional, as well as our national instruments that are actually binding signatory countries to act. So we're just going to look at Article 4 of the UNCRC, that is the General Comment number 19. It states that the state has an obligation to translate the rights of the convention into reality. So we all know that these international, regional, national instruments are calling for the rights of children, and we've seen that our national policies actually acknowledge that children have got right to education, right to health, right to water, and right to shelter. But there's also an aspect of financing that is brought in this instrument. So you find that these instruments then go on to give general comments that relates to financing. And for the UNCRC, you find that it is stating that states have an obligation to translate these rights, all these rights that we're acknowledging that children have, into reality. And the only way that these rights can be translated into reality is when we provide finances for those rights. So according to the general comment number 19, the obligation to undertake all appropriate measures includes: 1, the laws and the policies should be in place to support resource mobilization, budget allocation, and spending to realize children's rights. The necessary data and information about children should be collected, generated, and disseminated to support the design and implementation of appropriate legislation, policies, programs, and budgets to advance the rights of the child. Sufficient public resources should be mobilized, allocated, and utilized effectively to fully implement approved legislation, policies, programs, and budgets. Budgets should be systematically planned, enacted, implemented, and accounted for at the national and subnational levels of the state in a manner that ensures the realization of children's rights. So you find that all the rights that we are calling for, that we're advocating for, should then be translated into reality through the allocation of resources. And this is what the general comment number 19 is really speaking to. So what have been the sources of child rights financing? And we know that our governments have been doing it, our countries have been allocating resources towards education, health, for the sake of our children. But we also need to understand the structure of financing to say, where is the money coming from really? How is it structured? what are the sources of finances for children. So you find that resourcing for programs targeted for the benefit of children has been through a mix of sources, including the government, development assistance, and to some extent, the private sector. So you find we have in the bag of child rights financing, we have a mixture of the sources of finance. We've got government spending, we've got assistance from the development partners, and we also have the private sector.
Morning, how are you?
I'm fine, and you?
I'm fine.
Hello, sorry, there's somebody, Ndlovu, can you mute everybody who's not presenting, please? Thank you. You can continue, Natasha, sorry about that.
That's fine, thank you. So the sources, so we can see that our bag of financing for children has got various sources, a mixture of sources of finance. I was saying with government, development partners, and we also have the private sector playing a role in financing towards children. So you find that the bulk of the sources now is really coming from official development assistance, that is assistance from our development partners other than our government. So if you go back to our national budgets, look at the spending patterns, you'll find that sometimes our governments are only offering something like 20% towards financing for children, whereas the bulk of the money that is being used to finance children's programs is coming from development partners. So you find that government's commitment to fund these sectors remains low as they remain comfortable with dependence on the unsustainable ODA option. So the only disadvantage with that is that it comes with conditions. You find that if you're getting assistance from maybe the IMF and the World Bank, it comes with conditions. It's not like they're just giving you for free. And sometimes at the end of the day, it then puts pressure on the burden, the debt burden of the nation. So it's like you'll be fighting for two things. You're trying to deal with problems of finance. At the same time, you end up having a very high debt burden. So those are the disadvantages of relying on development assistance for financing for children. And again, it's really not sustainable because some of those programs, they come with at a specific period. So you find that programs may be targeted to be implemented for about 5 years. So we have financing for 5 years where we actually having an effective or a properly run project, maybe around immunization for children for 5 years. And then the other 5 years or 10 years down the line, we do not have anything supporting immunization for children. So it's very important for us to really start thinking about about the sources of financing. So you find at the stage of my presentation, we can have two questions that we can put on our parking lot to say, how best can we improve financing for children from our government? Is it a question of governments not committing, or it's a question of not having enough resources? Why is it that our governments are relying more on ODA other than mobilizing resources on their own, coming up with homegrown solutions? We also find that where the resources are allocated towards children, where our governments are actually allocating resources towards children, there's a challenge that these resources do not reach the intended beneficiaries. So you find that from the 20% that is allocated from the government coffers or even the ODA through the government, sometimes the resources do not really reach the children in need. So that's another challenge that we can also put on our parking lot to say, what is it that we can do to try and make sure that these resources get to the intended beneficiaries? They benefit the children in the rural areas, they benefit the disabled children, they benefit all the children who really need those resources. So this is it about the expenditure side. We can just think about the way we are financing, the sources of financing, and whether the resources are really getting to the intended beneficiaries. Then we move on to the tax justice, the tax part of it. We were saying tax justice refer to tax systems that generate sufficient public revenue. So you find there's an aspect of resource mobilization where we are saying, are we generating sufficient resources for the sake of our children, while ensuring that this revenue is fairly redistributed and focused on rebalancing the inequalities. So an effective tax system also looks into the issues of equity and equality to see whether the tax systems or the tax structures are rebalancing these inequalities. So we look at the tax systems through what we call the 4 Rs, and these are the functions of our taxes. So when we're looking at our tax systems and our tax structures, we should keep in mind the 4 Rs, that is the functions of tax. The first function refers to revenue, whereby we're saying tax is used as a way of resourcing essential services necessary for the survival, learning, and development of children. So when we look at our tax system and we think about our tax structures, we should think about whether the tax system or the tax structure is generating enough resources for the sake of our children, for the survival and development of our children. The second area is around redistribution, where we find that a tax policy instrument can be used to address inequality through progressive taxation and redistribution of revenue to the poorest and excluded through government budgets. So you find the tax system works in a way that the main function is to redistribute resources to make sure that the poor also benefit. And this is done through the progressive taxation systems, whereby you find that those who earn more are taxed more, and then those who earn less are taxed less. So it goes back, it reaches the amount of money that each and every family has. If you're talking about income tax, how is it structured? Is it a progressive income tax structure, whereby you find at the end of the day, a mother is left with enough disposable income to take care of her children, or a father is left with enough disposable income to take care of her children? So this is another function of our tax, which is the second R. Then we have an aspect of repricing, where a tax policy can be used to influence prices of goods and services. And under this, we are saying that we are pricing non-essential goods more than the essential goods. So what is it that we are referring to as essential goods? We need to think about essential goods for our children. And when you're looking at some of the essential goods, we think about maybe sanitary wear for the girls, to say, how are we pricing our sanitary wear, our essential good for the girls? Are we making it expensive, or we can actually make it cheaper and make alcohol more expensive for the benefit of our girl child? And just repricing is really thinking about making sure that we make our essential goods and services cheaper. And then there's also an aspect of representation, whereby a tax system strengthens the relationship between the state and children as citizens. So these are the 4 areas that we use when we're trying to think about our tax systems and our tax structures, to say, is the revenue aspect coming out for the sake of our children? How is this tax redistributing income? How our goods repriced, and is there an aspect of representation whereby when we call for any changes in the tax system, our government actually responds? So some of the key questions that we can ask around the tax is, as follows. So we have revenue. What is the main source of our government revenue in your country? Are there any missed opportunities for resource mobilization, especially from domestic sources? So the key question under the revenue aspect is around trying to mobilize enough resources, right? And you find that if we look at our tech systems, there are so many missed opportunities where we can actually be getting, where we can actually get enough resources to fund child-focused sectors. We have missed opportunities through maybe tax incentives that we give to our companies or tax holidays that you actually give to investors. You find that many developing countries have got these tax systems or tax structures where they're offering holidays to investors because the idea is to try and attract investment. But at the same time, this also reduces our opportunities for mobilizing resources and having domestic ways of mobilizing enough resources for our children. So we really need to think about, look at our tax structures and our tax systems and try to identify some of the opportunities that we are missing that could be very important for the sake of our children, for resource mobilization, for child-focused sectors. Then around redistribution, how progressive is our tax system? Does it leave the people with enough disposable income to take care of their families? This is the part where I was talking about our income tax structure, whether it is progressive or not. Is it leaving our families with enough disposable income to take care of our children? And are there any progressive government initiative, for example, the National Health Insurance? So sometimes you find that our tax system can be progressive enough for our government to actually have other initiatives that benefit everyone. And the example that I gave here is a National Health Insurance Plan, which is funded by the government. So those are the things that we should be thinking about when we're looking at our tax systems and our tax structures, whether there's really something that is coming out of it to try and redistribute income. Then there's also the aspect of repricing. What are the commodities? What commodities are considered as non-essential that can be made expensive? For example, alcohol. So when we look at our tax system or our tax structures, we can think about the commodities that we refer to as non-essential and see, okay, maybe we can actually make alcohol expensive, and then we make other essential goods for our children, maybe books, if they are books, if they are pens, or if you're saying now we need to make ICT equipment for our children much cheaper. It's just a matter of identifying the essential and non-essential good and look into it and try to reprice it. Then there's an aspect of representation. What are some of the children's concerns in relation to tax and the pricing of goods and services? For example, pink taxes, we have seen advocacy around the world. Maybe in Botswana, they've done it. They're advocating for issues around sanitary ware, and they were saying, I'm paying tax at a tender age, and they call it pink tax. So they were really calling on the government to reduce, to remove this kind of tax on them. So on the representation, we are talking about, we are really looking at some of the concerns that our children have around tax. So now when we have an idea of what we mean by fair financing and what we should be asking around tax, we need to know how best we can influence those things. We need to understand.
Sorry, we lost it. Okay, you can continue.
Okay, I was saying, so now when we have an idea about fair financing and also tax justice, we need to understand how best we can change these things. What is it that we need to do to try and make sure that we influence how the government spend or how the government mobilizes resources through tax. So what is it that we need to do? And the only way we can do it is through the budget process. We need to advocate for child-friendly budget. We need to mainstream child rights in the entire budget process. So what is it that we mean by child-friendly budgeting? Child-friendly budgeting is an applied budgeting where national or local council budgets are crafted with children in mind, reflecting the need of children's rights. So it's an applied system. It's not something that we are really, that is bookish to say we are doing child-friendly budgeting, but it is applied budgeting where we are budgeting with children in mind. We are making sure that the crafting of the budgets and the implementation of budgets is done with children in mind. So child-friendly budgeting rests heavily on the system upon which budgets are constructed. So when we construct our budgets, we have to make sure that we have children in mind. When we approve our budgets, we have children in mind. Again, when we implement, we are also implementing with children in mind. Those children who are in rural areas where the allocated funds are reaching the intended beneficiaries. And when we monitor as well as evaluate our budgets, we do that with children in mind. So it's really about taking part in the budget process, applying all the things that we know around financing and tax in the budget, in the entire budget cycle. So what does our budget cycle look like? This is just a standard budget cycle. The budget process, the stages that we have in our
Natasha, are you still there? Natasha, I think we may have lost connection with her. Is everybody still there though?
Yes.
Okay, I think we may have lost connection with her.
Yes, you can hear. I think she's trying to restart her screen.
Okay. Let's give her a minute.
Hello, everyone.
Hello? Yes.
Oh, that was my connection. My apologies about that. I'm not too sure. I'm not too sure where I lost you.
The budget process.
Okay, the budget process. Thank you for that. So I was talking about the budget process and saying this is the standard budget process in most of our countries, and we find that we have the drafting stage, the legislative stage.
Can you share your screen if possible?
Okay, let me go ahead and do that. Disruptions. I'm trying to share my screen now. Okay. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's fine. So I was talking about the budget process and saying this is the standard budget process that we have in our countries, where we have the drafting stage, the legislative and the implementation as well as the audit stages. So I was saying, because child-friendly budgeting is an applied budgeting, we need to take part in the entire budget process. We need to influence how budgets are enacted, how budgets are approved and implemented up to the audit stage. And it is very important that we take part in the drafting stage of our national budgets to make sure that all the needs of our children are identified at the drafting stage. You find that at this stage, this is where our our governments are producing what they call the budget strategy paper, which gives a roadmap of the budget, how it is planning to use its resources and how it is planning to mobilize resources. So at this drafting stage, it's very important for our CSOs to take part in helping the government to identify the needs of our children, because we have got CSOs working around different sectors. So we have CSOs working around child protection, some are really working around health, some are really working around nutrition. So to make sure that the needs of all these children are identified in the budget, we need to take part in the drafting stage. And then we move on to the legislative stage, whereby our parliament is approving the budget. The budget is tabled in the legislature and considered by parliamentary committees. This is where we find Parliament accepting, amending, or even rejecting the budgets if they do not meet the right standard or what they're calling for. So it is very important for us to also take part in to have a relationship with our Parliament so that they know some of the things that we're advocating for, to make sure that these things are actually included in our budget. As they approve, they also take note of the things that we are advocating for. And then the implementation stage. Remember when I was talking about a scenario whereby we have resources allocated towards child-focused sectors, where we have resources allocated towards child-focused sectors, but they do not really reach the intended beneficiaries. They don't reach the intended beneficiaries. So we need to make sure that the implementation stage is well taken care of, and this can be done. You find that our government is the executive is the one that carries out implementation, but our parliament comes in with the accountability side. So the executive tables reports on how they're using money, and it is important for us to also take part in the accountability process to make sure that the funds are reaching the intended beneficiaries under the implementation stage. And then we also have the audit stage, where we're having the Auditor General taking a look at the reports and reviewing how the money has been spent. So it's very important for us to make sure that we take part in the entire process to make sure that the needs of our children are well taken care of. So the role of Parliament in the entire budget process, you find that Parliament plays a very important role. And the first role that we get is the role when it approves the budget. From the budget process, you find that it is the one that has got the power of the purse. It approves the budget. So it's very important for us to make sure that before before the budget is tabled, Parliament has an idea of all the things that we are advocating for our children, so that they can actually bring those issues in the budgets as they approve the budgets. And then on the implementation stage, this is where we find our Parliament scrutinizing the reports that are sent, and this can be done through motions. When they move motions in Parliament, they ask questions, and they're also carrying out their business in committees. So the role that we're supposed to be playing in this is trying to make sure that our parliamentarians have an understanding of what is happening on the ground, because as CSOs, we know what is happening on the ground. So it's important for us to to give them, to assist them in crafting these questions for the question time in Parliament, and also for them to move motions in Parliament relating to what is happening on the ground. So CSOs are encouraged to engage with policymakers from time to time to ensure that the needs of the children are reflected in the national budgets. So what are some of the advocacy points that we have been calling for in relation to COVID-19, since we are living in difficult moments and we need to make sure that there are enough resources for our children? We need to think about advocacy around information, what measures have been put in place around information, the participation of children in decision-making around COVID-19. So we are really talking about the issue of engagement with Parliament, as it plays an important role in making sure that resources are allocated for our children. We also need to make sure that we need to ask some of the questions around health, relate to routine immunization programs. What has happened to the routine immunization programs, access to sexual reproductive health services, routine checks and clinics for expecting mothers, access to ARVs, psychosocial support. All those things need resources. So it's very important that we think about those things and bring them before Parliament. And issues around child protection, are there any safe houses for our victims of violence or rape, and education? What are some of the things that we need to improve now? The ICT, we need to fund the ICT department for the sake of our children, because we find that learning is now done remotely, and we really need to invest in our digital technology. Food security, what has happened to issues around school feeding programs, and all sorts of things. So the idea is really around engaging with Parliament and bringing our issues before Parliament so that they can act on it through their power of the purse. I think from this, I can say thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This is what I have on fair financing and tax justice. It was really about trying.
Natasha? Okay, Natasha, are you still there? Okay, I think we have lost connection with Natasha, but I think she has also finalized her presentation. She spoke to, very pertinent issues, and I think delved into, why we need to question our tax systems. Importantly, she mentioned, the need to ensure that revenue is fairly redistributed and focus on rebalancing of inequalities. I think for me that was very profound. Our taxation system need to essentially focus on how do we redistribute. How is it fairly redistributed, and how do we rebalance inequalities, particularly as it affects, the most vulnerable people? I think that was really great. The other thing is, which I think she'll respond to later, is the question of development assistance and debt burden. And the fact that, debts come with, conditions. How do we negotiate with, with donors on the question of, fair financing for children and tax justice for children? She also mentioned the fact that this is really not sustainable, yet most of our economies rely on, the development assistance. So how do we engage with this? How do we engage with, the international community, IMF, the World Bank, on the question of fair financing and tax justice for children? I think also that reminds me that this year, we as, the Child Rights Network for Eastern Africa, as well as the Child Rights Network for Southern Africa, engaged with the special committee that was constituted by the African Union to negotiate debt on behalf of Africa. And we really did put out the question of, the impact of COVID-19 on children, and the fact that this is the fair financing is an issue of human rights. Beyond the lofty financial terms that the committee was using, that they should look at it from the aspect of human rights, and the fact that the most vulnerable people were affected by the impact, the socio-economic impact of COVID-19. So thank you, Natasha, for that very brilliant presentation. So I just want to invite Mr. Munyuin. I know he has to leave by 10:30. So Mr. Munyuin, he's going to, share with us the CSO's perspective on what are your experiences in public financing of, child rights programs, including in the emergency context. We've had many emergencies in the context of Kenya, the floods, sometimes famine, and of course, right now, COVID-19. What has been your experience in advocacy with your network on fair financing and tax justice? Mr. Munyuin?
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for arranging this call, and thank you, Natasha, for setting pace and just enlightening us on what is really about tax justice. I'll maybe just giving a little thoughts on that, given our role as civil society organizations. And I'll be speaking from our experiences as Children Agenda Forum and also as African Institute for Children's Studies. Maybe a quick brief on who we are and how we came into being as Children Agenda Forum. So Children Agenda Forum is a child-focused CSO platform that began in 2015. And why we came into being is there was a convening, I must mention, by some colleagues from World Vision, Child Fund. And that stage, we realized that as much as the Sustainable Development Goals were being crafted, there was very little voices of child-focused CSOs. And just like your representation is very critical. So we set up to try and provide that platform where CSOs can be more heard and voices of children can then be engaged. And
hello, Mr. Munyuin, are you still there? I think he froze. Ndlovu, are you there? Could it be my connection that is not good?
Not really. I think we lost Munyuin.
Let me reach out to him.
Okay.
Okay, I've managed to reach him. He's changing his Wi-Fi source and will be able to join us shortly. But I also just kindly request that those from Kenya, if you could kindly send me a private message with your name. I can see some names. Just send me a private message with your name and perhaps phone number. If that is not too much to ask, just send me a private message on the chat with your name and phone number. All right, Mr. Munyuin just joined us.
Yeah, sorry, the Wi-Fi chooses to misbehave on such a special day. I've changed to another source.
Great, we're happy you're back.
Okay, great. I hope you can view my screen now.
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Thank you. So I was giving the background to the Children Agenda Forum and its purpose as a vehicle for ensuring that children voices are included in the Sustainable Development Goal agenda and questions around financing for development, which are equally very critical to the well-being. I will try and keep this in about 10-15 minutes maximum. And as I'll take us through what the history of governance. I think these are very important things. Let me not go through this list now. I'll go through each of them as I do the presentation. So I think it's very difficult to talk about tax justice, fairness in financing or distribution of resources without appreciating a little bit of a history of governance. And I am not a political science student or expert as such, but I think these two photos for me really speak a lot into why tax justice or why financing that is fair. If we remember that right from the history of man, that as a caveman, a lot of our lives then was about hunting today and sharing what we have. You know, you will bring whatever hunt you got, and it was roasted, and everyone ate on that table, and the story ended there. But when you move more into an agrarian revolution, then the need to save for tomorrow. You know, you can't eat all your grains in one day. Definitely became much more important. And then the question of whoever had labor to do enough will get more harvest, and that more harvest will then, of course, mean I will have more labor hires, more laborers hired in the next season. And then, of course, the weakest person who could not go and work is unlikely to have the kind of fair share of resource as you will expect. And I think to me, that really brings in the basis then of having a governance system where we choose a few of us who then say, okay, we may not all contribute to production in the same level for various reasons, sometimes disability, some for many other reasons. But how do we still ensure that none of us lives out a life that is less of dignity? And I'm sure all of us who've engaged in the conversation around providing services, that we've shifted from a needs-based approach where we are then thinking about so-and-so is really in need. Can we provide some supplies? To a rights-based approach where we are saying every human being has a right and they need to be able to live with dignity wherever they are. Children, elderly, persons with disability. And how do we then ensure that that happens? Who has responsibility to do that? And going back to the analogy of the caveman to the agrarian revolution, appreciating that when someone has the responsibility to gather and ensure that whatever is gathered is fairly distributed, and in this case is taxes, how do we then ensure that children who unfortunately do not many times have the platform, or we've not facilitated them to have the platform to negotiate when it comes to how we share those resources, that their voices too are heard. And I think that is really the essence then of having a civil society and parliamentary kind of representation to ensure that this happens, because the agency or the institution that has that responsibility is the government. So if we are finding children who cannot live dignified life, then we've got to ask ourselves, are their voices being heard? And are those of, is the government or whoever in governance system having the capacity to respond to that, either in terms of being listening to those voices, or also having the right infrastructure in terms of legislation and even programs that respond to that. So, you know, I'll just summarize that or bring out still the question of tax justice using this canopy. That usually the crop or the plant that is at the lowest of the canopy, of course, doesn't have as much access to resources, you know, sunlight, sometimes even water, and they're likely to be dwarfed. And I think that is really in a very simple way of describing describing, that when we are expecting some tax justice and fairness, then we have to look at how well have we responded to those who are at the lower end of being able to engage in the conversation around distribution of resources. And the canopy to me is really a critical thing. So even as Natasha was saying, first of all, are children on that table of negotiating? Are their voices being heard? And also very important is how fair then is that distribution? And sometimes I think as civil society, we can forget that if you're on that table of the politician who is supposed to help in distribution of this grain that we have brought together, then you have many competing priorities. And sometimes the noise, the most noisy voice, so to say, the loudest voice will be the one that you are attempted to respond to. So how do we balance that? That when we are on the table, health issues, gender issues, child protection, education issues will need to compete on that. And how do we ensure that then there is fairness? Plus the question of, our former President Kibaki used to say, if you want some great goodness and demand on tax justice, pay your taxes. How do you also bring in that conversation as a role in civil society? I will point into about these 2 or 3 bullets on talking about our experience as civil society. One of those that I've engaged in for a while now is the street connected children. These are children living and working in the streets. And I don't think they're absent in any of the countries in the region. One of the conversations we've had is when you look at the section 37 of the Children's Act in Kenya, it makes it very clear that the Director for Children's Services or the Department for Children's Services does have responsibility in ensuring that no child lives a life where they are vulnerable to further exploitation and abuse. And children living and working in the street are definitely a very obvious group that are exposed to this. And when we ask ourselves, so what does it cost us to really ensure that no child lives and works in the street? In a census that was done by the National Bureau of Statistics, and I think there's a report that was released last year, we have about 3,000 street-connected children who live in the streets of Nairobi, who sleep there actually. So there are about 50,000 who come and live, and there are about 3,000 who sleep there. If you really ask yourself, what does it cost to ensure that that child doesn't sleep there? If you put that as a capitation fund, the estimates have been just about 30,000 shillings per year will help a child get to be reintegrated within either foster care family. And of course, we are encouraging, and the policy is very clear that you want family-based alternative care. And yet, when you look at the amount of money that is allocated to the Street Families Rehabilitation Trust Fund, and compare that to maybe what else we are spending as the members of the county assembly or the parliamentary assembly at the county level, as DSA, their allowances for sitting in meetings. It's really nothing compared to that. But then think about, what does it cost us, say, when a child who's lived in the street and felt very vulnerable and felt hopeless gets to be recruited into a gang that sometimes leads into very horrific things that we've seen here. I know there's definitely no data really showing a strong link between poverty and recruitment into Al-Shabaab, for example. But we know that vulnerability is much more higher for such a child to feel like, I will take any other option other than being in the street. It costs us much more in terms of security and many other things by simply not investing about $300 per year for every child so that none of them is in the street. Are there mechanisms to be able to do that? Yes, as civil society groups, there are a number of us who've already developed very clear systems on what it takes to remove a child from the street and reintegrate them back into a family in a very sustainable way. All they require is funding that does not come from well-wishers. And unfortunately, a lot of these have been from other countries other than Kenya. I think as a country, it is very practical for us to be able to handle this. And of course, talking about COVID, it's really made it very naked how unjust we are. Look at the social distancing. How do you talk about social distancing in a classroom of 100 children when it's supposed to be about 35 for every teacher? And how would you expect that out of 40 years of investing in our school infrastructure, that we can change that in 3 months and do it differently? And indeed, I think it's been shown that countries that have responded very well to COVID-19 are those that are not trying to react right now and put in an effective social protection, which includes schools, because we've seen the rise in teenage pregnancy and all these matters in this season. So how well are we able to respond to COVID-19 depends on the previous investment of social protection measures. You know, that includes questions around how much is the country investing in access to labor or jobs that are decent, you know. So I think these are the conversations that one must have when you're talking about children, and not just look at specific aspects, because every time the government is asked, are we investing enough on children? They will say about 30% of our national budget goes to education. But you forget that in a human rights approach, even one life, one right being abused is that big. And of course, like I give you the example of the street connected children, by not responding to 3,000 children, we spend much more on security and the loss of investment by of potential investors, because we don't look like we are a safe space to be able to invest by the investors. So for sure, there is no way we're going to get into a sustainable development goal if we don't think about a fair investment in children and child rights, and also tax justice in terms of how do we distribute. And we know in the case of Kenya is one of those countries that have been shown that the gap between the have and the have-nots seem to have really grown. So you have a GDP that we are flagging and saying the economy is growing, but it's growing in very few people. And of course, the question of retributive distribution of a fair distribution of services, fair distribution then when it comes to other matters, come in to haunt us ultimately in our security and many other things. So what then should be our role, and how have we done in doing that? I think we can do this without defining civil society. There could be many definitions out there, but I picked this from the Oxford Dictionary, and it says, is a society considered as a community of citizens linked by common interests and collective activity? When you think about that and ask ourselves, so is the civil society in Kenya really defined by this? Are we effective in being able to demand and ensure that children voices are involved and taken seriously in the national planning, in the budget cycle, and the other areas? It comes back to this. How well are we organized? And of course, coming from some analysis by the World Economic Forum, that there's a paradigm shift. And in the case of Kenya, we've come from a period when our governance structure was really not pro-democracy. It was very closed. And the civil society was synonymous with strikes, with carrying placards and demanding. And I think there was definitely a space of that. But globally, I think there's a greater shift where we are appreciating that the civic space, in terms of the ability to demand for fairness for every human being around us, affects business. And so businesses more and more are being required to demonstrate that how you've produced your coffee, there is no exploitation of children in that. You know, governments are more and more expected to really demonstrate and bring a strong link between private and public partnership. And I think that is where the nexus comes in with the role of CSOs and being able to work together. So suffice it to say that really the question of representation is very, very critical. But who is representing who? Who gave you the mandate? You know, and can children themselves have their voices being heard? Very unfortunate. I've been in forums where we're meeting with the government ministers in Kenya. And I remember this permanent secretary who was actually in charge of this, the department that is responsible for social protection and children, saying this question of children voices, you know, can children really say anything? I mean, you really see that there's very limited understanding and appreciation on the importance of voices of children. Or then the question of, are the instruments that we have, the policy and legislations that we have, demand or make it very clear that voices of children will need to be heard. As I come towards closing, just on my brief on what is the role of CSOs and government and parliaments, I want to touch on what are we experiencing as the gap. Having a civil society here and also engaging with the East African child rights network, and so having conversations at the regional level is our history. If you look at the history of civil society in Kenya, which the documented picks up from 1940s and thereabout, and it starts off with missionaries coming in to try and meet needs in health sector, in education sector. So it was really a needs-based approach. And even as the public and the government, I think we've not shared that off, where we look at civil society's role as meeting a gap in service delivery. But really, if you look at a rights-based approach, I have no business providing services because I don't collect taxes. So how can we shift that? And unfortunately, we sit in tables with government teams, and you see more voice, or rather more ear, being provided of listening to CSOs that seem to have greater budgets. And of course, this perpetuates this gap, where then we do not even have the capacity to be able to demand of governments who have responsibility to provide this. Then, of course, there's the question of limited public participation. And I don't think in the case of Kenya, with our new constitution, is not really the problem of the government system or just the law. It is more the public itself really still not appreciating that we do need that kind of a role. And when you call for a review of the county integrated development plan, or the various plans that have been put in place, very few people do turn out. But of course, in a recent survey that I did with looking at access to health systems in Mandera County, this is the dry, arid areas with a lot of nomadics. Some of the people there are asking, why do you really want me to participate in that process? All I want is a good health system. So the question of who exactly should represent and do that person have capacity maybe also comes in. So maybe our definition of public participation also needs to be interrogated, and the question of representation really properly answered. In the case of Kenya also, though I'll say a few other countries in East Africa, I think Ethiopia, for example, there's been the question of the space for civil society engagement. How are we allowed to speak? And for us in Kenya, it's been a very challenging period of learning, because we are moving from where you are not allowed to speak to a space where, yes, you can knock onto the minister's office and go and speak. But I liken it to, the way you come and meet in the lobby or in the living room, and then I'll walk back with my spouse and go and make the real decisions in our bedroom. Do the CSOs have access to the bedroom where the real decisions are being made? Because it looks like no. So we'll make all the noise, present all the papers. We have a very good case. We've lobbied around the children bill in Kenya for the last 4 years. Actually, not 4 years, the last 12 years. The last 4 years brought in a more stronger attempt to do this, a lot of investment. But it looks like 2-3 people need to make that decision. And there's a lot of irrelevance in maybe going into the street, because someone will ask you, why are you going into the street when you have the space to come and speak to me? But you will speak in the living room, you walk into the bedroom and make decisions. So how do we really ensure that there's real legal space for that? And are the NGOs having the capacity, or the CSOs for that matter, having the capacity to demand this? The question of validity for representation, communities are asking. You've had others say nothing going on for NGOs. Are we really having, be able to go back in terms of our own accountability to the public and say, I received this money and this is how I spend it, or in the things that I've been talking about, this is the change that we've been able to contribute towards. But again, being very aware that we shouldn't be expected to deliver services. So the public or government should not measure our effectiveness as CSOs by how many people I'm able to provide healthcare, because it's none of my business. That is really the role of the government. Back into what Natasha said, FFD, we cannot have situations where a bulk of our funding for social services is done by people from out there. Honestly, I get very embarrassed when I see computers being delivered by the European Commission. A laptop, honestly, we should be able to afford that. So how do we ensure then that groups, things such as the public benefit organizations and the law that we recently put in place is effected and comes in with financing from the government? Because for sure we do have a role as civil society, just like I showed earlier on. Business community, civil society, and governments have a role to ensure that countries are sustainably developed. As I close out, so what then are the opportunities that I see in this? Just going back to the budget cycle, I think every of these steps really have an importance in ensuring that civil societies are able to work together well enough with other sections, parliament, to ensure that how we spend our money, we get value for it. And where the rubber meets the road in the child rights advocacy is in the budget, because the more we spend. Let me give a very quick sample of some analysis. I think in this country, in Kenya, some of the largest CSOs that are spending in terms of budgets will be spending about 10 billion Kenya shillings. So that is like what? I'm trying to convert that into dollars for the benefits of those who hear. But overall, if you pick about 7 of those and then other smaller agencies, we could be spending about 100 billion Kenya shillings. So like $1 billion per year from the civil society organizations. That is a small fraction of the budget that the government has from about 3 trillion Kenya shillings budget. So how comes the government cannot be able to fund all these things and literally be able to meet the needs? Is there a space for CSOs? For sure, because there are moments when it becomes ineffective for government to provide services to a small population. Or sometimes you need a model intervention that will work for a smaller population. So I think that is where we definitely have a role, and ensuring that we have models that turn into policy documents that then inform the budgeting process. So that's where the sector policy reviews come in. So do we have the right policies? I think CSOs have that role, plus providing models and also ensuring that these policies are implemented. Are the laws and the institutions that are created consistent with our social goals? Do we even have social goals? I think that is really the missing link. And you see it a lot that even within our, the agenda for example, that the current government is implementing. How much are we appreciating that the more you take care of the weakest people in our population, the more we're able to grow together? There's no country that has been able to do well unless you respond well to a strong and effective social protection system. The leadership in public participation and having oversight on the government. So I think in the interest of time, I'll close it up at that. Over to you, Anita.
Thank you very much for that very brilliant presentation, Samuel. I think you did justice to help our colleagues who are perhaps not Kenyan to understand what we are dealing with. You raised very pertinent issues. Issues are your closing remark on social protection. That is really how we are able to judge how much a government is caring to the most vulnerable population. So thank you very much for that. I think without much further ado, I know you are leaving now, but I just want to open this up for questions because we are really pressed for time. There are a couple of questions, perhaps, Sam, if you could answer maybe 1 or 2, and then you can leave, because I know you wanted to leave at 10:30. Are there any questions for Sam at this point? Yes, and I know people are asking for the presentations. We will avail all the presentations to the participants on email. So that will be done. If you're Kenyan, please also send me your phone number and name on the chat box. But I think if you have any question, please just raise up your hand and then we can be able to respond to you. But I think, for some, perhaps because we want some to leave, I think you've mentioned very pertinent issues in relation to observing the budget cycle within Kenya. But perhaps there's a question that you could respond to in relation to the debt burden. As Kenyans, we've been complaining about the debt burden. We can't seem to not want to end to borrow. We are constantly borrowing. Have CSOs in Kenya thought about, how have we engaged government in the question of debt burden, and particularly on how this debt burden affects children? I think it's something that perhaps you could respond to as we wait for other questions, if there are there. Sam?
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks for raising that question. I think it's very pertinent to the sector that we basically transferring debt. I think the other day I listened to, I think PLO Lumumba was making a presentation that while in other countries, children are born and they have a certain amount of assets, allocated to them by the government and even to the third generation, our grandchildren already have a debt. Are we engaging then in ensuring that the debt conversation or the choosing or when are we going to borrow is being done? So I guess what the question is asking, number one, are we engaging? I think yes, there are CSOs that are engaging, but maybe it goes back to just what I mentioned in my presentation. Are we meeting in the lobby and the fellows who actually make decisions walk into the bedroom and make decision and say, who cares? So how do we really ensure that our voices count? I think we rally the stakeholders, the children themselves, to have this. We also cannot be very simplistic and say countries cannot borrow. Even within our own private or personal lives, we know that sometimes to get over certain things, to get over poverty, so to say, you may need to borrow. But is it then the question of accountability in the management of those debts that have been brought on board? So I think as CSOs, we need to retreat, as those of will say in Kenya, okay, let's get to the tent, Yapaleju, and let's have a conversation and really ask ourselves, why are our voices not being heard? How can we ensure that the question of validity of a representation is taken seriously? Because it looks like until politicians realize that the constituency that you're representing really listen to you and that constituency have votes, then they really don't care about your say.
Thank you very much, Sam. I think one last one from Professor Njoka, who's really emphasizing, the issue around, sorry, I've lost it. Co-creating. How do we co-create with the private sector? In terms of products and services with CSOs and supporting states to forge these partnerships. Are you engaging private sector as you leave? And also, you could perhaps respond to what extent are you engaging the private sector within the Kenya Coalition, and also, just share your final remarks as you depart.
Thank you. So I think there have been attempts and still going. I'll give you an example. I sit in a national steering committee that is looking at stopping child trafficking. And we do have the trade union there. We have the Kenya employers organizations in there and private sector. So I think, yes, there's an opportunity to do this, but perhaps what Njoka, my friend, is saying that should go beyond this is, are we having models that then we can create that address the needs? Think about, for example, access to maternal health care. There are private sector organizations that have tried to present this, but because it takes quite a while before such products are able to have a return on investment or to be even viable as a private business entity, you sort of need a bit of cushioning through a social protection or social enterprise kind of thing. How accessible then do we have? Do they have access to, say, National Health Insurance Fund, so that as I set up my clinic that is meant to meet the need of the poorest, then they do have access to that. Let me give you one more last example on that. Back to the street connected children. My argument has been, even in the very developed countries, they are not able to employ enough children officers to so to say police and remove these children and provide psychosocial support and move them out there. But what they have done, and I have a very good example of the Arizona State Department that I engaged with for about 3 months through a research fellowship, that instead of them being the ones who employ enough number of officers, then they work with community-based organization and private sector, who will be the ones to, when you identify a child, call 116. When I call 116, 116 will call the nearest service provider, who will be a CBO or a private sector there. And that group will be able to develop its own most effective approach to reintegrating children back into a family-based care. And that will be very useful because it allows us then to develop context-based solutions. You know, if I'm in Mandera or in Kisumu in Kenya, you know, there are differences in cultural issues on how we support children, but working with the community-based, private sector-based, and having the government to provide funding to those who are meeting social needs that are not going to break even in terms of business easily, I think a very critical part of ensuring this works out. So Anita, like you say, for my parting shot, I really have to move to the other call. I think, like I mentioned in one of the slides, there is no country that will develop sustainably if it does not think about the weakest. A good friend of mine says, think about the public transport. If you're going to invest in a very sustainable, effective, efficient public transport, think about a transport that will make it for persons with disability. Because when that works, then everyone else will be covered. But if you're going to think about transport system that